In this Spider-Man limited set review, I will be covering all of the commons and uncommons in MTG's Spider-Man set to help you prepare for your limited events. I'll also be showcasing the digital versions of the cards, so if you're playing on MTG Arena, you'll also be ready to go. First up, we'll look at the card evaluation grading scale that I'll be using, starting off with the best cards. These are cards you actively want to play. If you're in sealed, you'll often try to play the color that has the highest number of your best cards, and in draft, you'll be taking these cards very highly. Next are solid cards. These are cards you will mostly play when you are in that particular color. So they almost always make the cut. In sealed, they make up the bulk of your deck. In draft, they make up the bulk of your deck. You're taking them throughout the pack, usually throughout the middle of the pack, and they're generally cards you're pretty happy playing. Next are filler cards. These are cards you will sometimes play. Either they have a very specific home, so maybe they only fit into one archetype, or they're just a little bit less powerful than the solid cards that you will be happier playing. Next are build-around cards. These are cards that need certain conditions to be useful, but if you do meet those conditions, they can be good. So oftentimes they're more high on the synergy piece of the card, but when you get there, they can be quite good. And then there's bad cards. These are cards you should rarely play because they're just a little bit less powerful or very, very niche. Next is the way you kind of build your deck in sealed using these grades. So you want to have by color and then by best solid on your filler cards. So basically it would look something like this. We'll cover these cards in more detail later, but you kind of sort out by your best cards, your solid cards, your filler cards, and then you can have a really good idea of which colors you should be playing when building your deck. The archetypes in MTG Spider-Man will influence the card evaluations because they will influence what synergies you should be going for with specific cards and specific color combinations. There are 5 archetypes in this set: green-white web slinging, which is a deck built around the web slinging mechanic, which is called in web on the digital client. But web slinging basically rewards you for having a nice aggressive curve and then having some cards that have enters the battlefield effects and or leaves the battlefield effects. Blue-white is a modified strategy, so that's a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters, auras, and equipments. And then there is blue-black, which is villains, so that's like a typal synergy deck where you just have cards that are villains and cards that care about you having villains. Red-black is a mayhem deck, which lets you cast cards from your graveyard with the mayhem mechanic, and that's going to be a deck that cares about discarding cards and then casting cards from your graveyard and then getting value that way. And then red-green is big spells, so it cares about casting cards that cost 4 or more mana. The mechanics in this set, first up is web slinging, so relatively simple mechanic. You can cast the card for its normal cost, so in the case of Spider-Man Web Slinger, it's 2 and a white for a 3/3, or you can cast it for web slinging, and if you do, you also return a tapped creature you control to your hand, and it does have to follow timing restrictions. So you can cast Spider-Man Web Slinger for its normal cost or its web slinging cost anytime you could cast a creature, which means during your main phase. Next mechanic is the Mayhem mechanic, so a card like Electro's Bolt can be cast for 2 and a red to deal 4 to target creature, but you can cast it from your graveyard for 1 and a red. If you discarded it this turn, timing rules still apply, which means you can still only cast it at sorcery speed. And then the next mechanic and final mechanic we'll be covering is a returning mechanic, Connive, which basically says draw a card, then discard a card. If you discarded a non-land card, put a +1/+1 counter onto the creature that is conniving. So Doc Ock's Henchman is an example, 2 and a blue for a 2/1 flash that when it attacks, it connives. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can start diving into the set. First up, we have Web Up, or Mothwing Shroud if you're playing on Arena. And just as a small note, as we get into the cards, you'll notice in the upper left corner, I have color-coded it based on this being in the best category. And so you'll be able to see that with all of the cards for the best, solid, filler, build-around, or bad categories. You'll be able to see that color-coded box in the upper corner, which can help you when you're sorting and building your decks. But Web Up is a really good removal spell. 3 mana is just totally efficient. There's not a ton of enchantment removal, so you're going to be able to answer most of the things you care about and then end up with a nice little removal spell for relatively cheap. Next is Spider UK, or Sarn of the Silken Throne. Solid body for the mana, but what you really care about with this card is the ability to get a constant stream of card advantage, and the fact that you can use this for web slinging for only 3 mana, or in web, so that is the digital equivalent of web slinging, means that you're going to sometimes be able to set this up to be able to trigger it immediately. So if you're on turn 5, you can sometimes web slinging back one of your 2-drops if it was able to get through and by attacking, and then you can replay that 2-drop and then immediately get the card on your following turn. And because you're drawing extra cards, it'll help you set up for future card draws by getting 2 creatures entering the battlefield under your control in a turn. So that's a really nice card to have access to. Next is City Pigeon. So this card is a 1/1 flyer for 1, and when it leaves the battlefield, you create a food token. If you are playing the web slinging deck, this card is fantastic. It's not quite as good in the modified deck because again, unless you're putting a bunch of counters on it, which it doesn't really necessarily help with individually, but it's a really solid card in either one of those decks. So you can use it as a really good enabler for your web slingers because it's a 1/1 flyer, so it's going to be able to attack, going to be able to get itself tapped, and then when you bounce it back to your hand with your web slinging cards, you're going to be able to replay it again pretty easily. So City Pigeon is great in web slinging, pretty solid and modified if you are able to put some counters on it with flying, and so it's a really solid card. Next is Costume Closet. This card's really good in the modified deck. It's going to be able to come into play, start putting counters on your creatures, and then when those creatures leave the battlefield, you get to put the counters back onto the Costume Closet to use it again. One thing worth noting about this card is you often want to put the counters onto different creatures, because if a modified creature leaves the battlefield, you only put a single counter onto the Costume Closet. So if you've put all your counters onto one creature, when it leaves play, you're still only going to get one counter back. But if you've spread those counters around, when those creatures die, you'll get more counters back onto your Costume Closet. So that's just a nice little note, but definitely a solid card for the modified deck. Next is the Daily Bugle Reporters. This card has some great flexibility. You're going to be able to generally put into play and then put a counter on each of up to 2 creatures. So often it will come into play as a 3/4, and then you'll put counters onto a counter onto one of your other creatures, or you can spread the counters around to enable some attacks immediately. This is another card that if you can somehow connect with it, or have it get tapped, then you can bounce it back to your hand with web slinging and then cast it again. You can get extra value from the counters, or just use the investigative journalism mode to get target creature with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand, which is another nice mode to have access to, especially if you're casting this when you have an empty board state, because then you can immediately get some value as well. And of course, the digital version is called Principled Referee, but does the same things. Next is Flash Thompson Spider-Fan, or Basil Cabaretti Loudmouth. It's a 2-mana 2/2 Flash, which is already solid stats, and then you can tap a creature or untap a creature when it enters, which is just going to be pretty helpful in enabling your potential attacks by tapping their creatures. If you untap a creature, you can sometimes ambush your opponent's creature, and sometimes you might want to tap one of your creatures so that you can then cast a web slinging card or something like that if you really want to get some crazy synergies going like that. So it's just kind of a nice little useful thing to be able to do. And sometimes you could even flash it in when you couldn't block, just to untap your opponent's attacker so they couldn't web sling something back using that creature. So that's another kind of interesting thing you can do with this card, but overall totally solid 2-drop. Next is Selfless Police Captain. So 2-mana 1/1, but it enters with a counter, and when it leaves the battlefield, you put its counters onto target creature you control, also known as Crime Scene Instructor. So the interesting thing about this card is if you do web slinging it back, you will still get that leaves the battlefield trigger, so keep that in mind with this card. It's also a card you can put counters on when you're modified decks and then kind of get double value from them, because if the card dies, you put the counter somewhere else, and generally just a pretty solid 2-drop. Next is Silver Sable Mercenary Leader, or Generous Betty Ray. So you get a 3-mana 2/3, but it enters and puts a counter on another creature, so kind of like 3/4 worth of stats, which is already pretty good. And then when it attacks, you can give a modified creature lifelink, and it will modify a creature by putting a counter on it itself. So you can give the creature you put the counter on lifelink if you're able to attack with the Silver Sable. And so that's just a pretty nice card to have access to, especially if you're playing against an aggressive deck where you're in a racing situation. So Silver Sable, pretty solid, though of course you want to make sure that you are able to attack with it to truly maximize the card, so maybe then put some counters onto itself or something like that. It can target itself if you are able to modify it. So if you put counters onto the Silver Sable with a different card, then the Silver Sable can give itself lifelink, which is pretty cool. Next is Spectacular Tactics. It is a card that is flexible by being able to be a +1/+1 counter and hexproof, which is a nice way to protect your creatures or sometimes win a small combat. And then destroying a creature with power 4 or greater means that in the late game, it's also a pretty good removal spell. So Spectacular Tactics, really solid card, really flexible. The combat trick mode isn't the greatest, but your opponent is going to be incentivized to block your creatures to try and deny you from web slinging. And so that can sometimes let you set up a blowout more often than you would in other situations. Next is Spider-Man Web Slinger, or Darval, whose web protects. So we've already covered this card a little bit, but it's fairly straightforward. In a web slinging deck, it's going to be pretty nice because you'll have cards that want to leave play, and so it's a good synergy piece there, but it's not really a card you care about in your modified decks because you oftentimes aren't going to want to load up counters onto your creatures only to return them to your hand with web slinging. So the card doesn't really fit into the modified decks as well, but a 3-mana 3/3 is just a solid card usually in any deck, and the fact that it has this extra upside for your web slinging decks means it's going to be a nice card there. Next is Sudden Strike. So destroy an attacking or blocking creature. It's efficient, but it can't deal with cards unless they're rumbling in combat. So sometimes your opponent will have a key card that you aren't able to answer with this, which is why it just gets a solid grade instead of a best grade. Next is Starling Aerial Ally, moving towards the filler cards here. This card's just a little bit inefficient because it just gives you a 5-mana 3/4 that buffs a creature temporarily to give it flying, or Etsy, Eztli of the Thousand Moons is the digital version. But basically, a 5-mana 3/4 flyer is reasonable, the effect is reasonable, but overall the card's a bit expensive at 5 mana and isn't going to provide a game-swinging effect, and so it's a card that you don't really have to prioritize. I mean, it can be a game-swinging effect, but it's not. It's just like at 5 mana, you need to have a lot from your cards to have them be pretty good. A card you're really happy playing. Next is Wild Pack Squad, or Free Strider Aces. 3 mana 2/3 is just a little bit weak on the stat line, even though its effect is totally reasonable. It's a card you can play, just not one that you're really going to want to prioritize. First Strike and Vigilance is solid, but one of the problems is that giving your creature Vigilance can mess with your web slinging shenanigans, so it's just a little bit awkward sometimes in that case as well. Next is Aunt May, or Zora Spider Fancier. 1 mana 0/2 is just a really weak stat line, but if you do have enough spiders, then having them all come into play with counters and gaining you some life can be useful. It's just generally you don't want to play 0-powered creatures because they aren't going to be able to help you swing the game, and if you top deck this in the late game, it's really bad. So this one's on the lower end and really a card you're trying to avoid, but sometimes you can play it if you have tons of spiders. Next is Thwip, or Lively Leap. So +2/+2 gives a creature flying. If it's a spider, you gain 2 life. Totally solid combat trick. It's just combat tricks are never a huge priority. This does get a little bit better if you are in a deck that has spiders, because you can gain the life, and also a deck that cares about web slinging, because your opponent is going to want to block your creatures to stop you from web slinging with them post combat, and then Thwip is going to be pretty solid there. So it does get a little bit better in those decks, but it's never a card you really prioritize. Next is Web Shooters. It's kind of a clunky equipment, or Archangel or Skyrod. It's 2 mana to play, 2 mana to equip, so that's 4 mana you're in already, and then you only get +1/+1 and reach, and then you get a bit of a tapping ability, and so that's just kind of too inefficient to be a card you're happy playing, and as such, it's usually not a priority, and best left on the sidelines in most cases. Moving on to the blue cards, we're back to the best category, Spider Bite Web Warden, or Argear Title Spinner. So 3 mana for a 2/2 that bounces a non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Is just a really solid card. You can bounce your own permanents if you have something with a really good enters effect, but usually you're going to get a great tempo play by bouncing your opponent's creature and be quite happy with it. Next is Whoosh, or Snatch Back. So 2 mana for a bounce spell. You can bounce your own spells once again with the own cards with this once again. And then Kicker, which lets you spend a couple of extra mana to draw a card. Usually you want to wait until you're able to pay the Kicker, because bouncing something and drawing a card is much better than just bouncing something. But the flexibility, the fact that you can get a card back from it is just really, really nice. And this card is excellent. Next is Madame Web, Clairvoyant, or Alex, Mouth to Many Eyes. So it's very expensive at 6 mana for just a 4/4, but it does get you a lot of card advantage by letting you cast spider spells and, importantly, non-creature spells from the top of your library. And then when you attack, you can mill a card, so you can sometimes reset that top card of your library if need be. You don't have to attack with Madame Web, notably. So if you have like a random small flyer, you can attack with that small flyer, mill away the top of your library, and maybe hit a non-creature on top that you can then play. So a pretty nice late game card advantage engine that hopefully will stick around for a couple turns and help you take over the game. Next is Flying Octobot, or Vexed Bot. So this is a card that fits perfectly into the villains deck, but isn't really as good in the modified deck, though of course getting some counters on it is going to happen a lot of the time, because there are some villains that you'll be playing in your blue-white decks. But basically it's a 1/1 flyer that grows over the course of the game, and a card you're very happy playing in your villains deck, and kind of moderately happy playing in your modified decks, so it just gets a solid grade. Next is Beetle, Legacy Criminal, or Arala, Hedron Scaler. So 4 mana for a 3/3 flyer, totally solid stat line. The fact that you can then get extra value if you exile it from your graveyard, also totally solid. So this is a really solid card that kind of fits perfectly into that category. It's not crazy, because playing a 4 mana 3/3 flyer isn't the greatest stat line these days. It's just totally good stat line, just not exceptional. It's not like taking over the game type stat line, but it's just a card you're going to be happy playing. Next is Chameleon, Master of Disguise, or Vazin, Two-Faced Trickster. And also keep in mind, any card that has the villain type line is going to get a little bit better in the blue-black decks that care about having villains, and so that's going to be pretty noteworthy as well. But Chameleon, Master of Disguise, is just a pretty reasonable card as a way to copy your other good creatures, and it has the Mayhem mechanic. So not going to be necessarily as useful as it would be in a red-black deck that's more focused on Mayhem, but still really nice upside to have, because if you discard this to a Connive ability, or you discard this to one of the other discard effects that is found in black that is used to enable the Mayhem deck, then you're going to get a nice little mana discount on this, and oftentimes going to be able to copy something pretty reasonable with this. Notably, it can only copy creatures you control, but it does get better in the late game because once you have like your 5 and 6 drops in play, being able to copy those for 4 or 3 mana is going to be pretty nice. So definitely a nice little late game tool for your blue decks. Next is Robotics Mastery. This is a card that can absolutely blow out your opponent, but can be a little bit tricky to use as well, because if your opponent plays around it, it's going to be a little bit harder to use. But 5 mana for a flash enchantment that gives the enchanted creature +2/+2 can totally win you a combat, and when it enters, you get 2 1/1 robot artifact creatures with flying. So that's going to mitigate the downside of not being able to use it as a combat trick. You still get those 1/1s, you buff your creature. It's going to be a pretty solid card. It's going to get worse over the course of the format as people know to play around it a little bit more, but if you blow out somebody with this, win a combat, and get the 2 1/1s, you're going to be in fantastic shape. Next is Mysterio's Phantasm, back down to the filler category. Just a 2 mana 1/3 isn't the greatest stats, but it does have flying and vigilance, so it's going to be able to chip in, going to be able to fill your graveyard, which some cards care about, and just going to be an okay card to play in your decks, just not a crazy priority. Next is Amazing Acrobatics, and it's also a villain, so that's worth noting. Amazing Acrobatics, it's a card that can counter something, or you can tap a couple of creatures, so sometimes you can get some value there. Drick's Interception is the digital version. I guess the last card, digital version, was Phantasmal Vision instead of Mysterious Phantasm, but Drick's Interception is the digital version of this card. Amazing Acrobatics is going to be just very fillerish card. You play it a little bit more often in Sealed, where counter spells are a bit better because the format's slower, there's more expensive cards getting played a lot of the time in Sealed, but generally not a card you're too happy playing. Next is Doc Ock, Sinister Scientist, or Ozor, Chronicler of Collapse. So 5 mana 4/5, not the best stat line, but it does get huge if you can fill your graveyard to 8 cards or more, which is a little bit hard to do. And if you have another villain, it's hexproof. So kind of a solid-ish card if you can fill your graveyard, but not every deck is going to be able to do that. And it only really gets activated in the super late game, which doesn't happen all that often anyway. Next is Doc Ock's Henchman, or Obscura Alley Lurkers. So the 2/1 flash that attacks and connives can help you fill your graveyard, can help you, but enabling it, getting it more than one attack in with your 2/1 creature is going to be tricky, even if it does get a +1/+1 counter on it from conniving. So Doc Ock's Henchman going to be a little bit tricky to use, but a card you can play if you need to. Next is Oscorp Research Team, or Pinnacle Research Team. So 4 mana 1/5, not the greatest stat line, but it does help you stall the game, so you can get to the activated ability of 7 mana, draw 2 cards. If you are able to get to that point, you can take over the game, but a 4 mana 1/5 in the meantime is kind of tricky, and it's not a villain or anything like that, and so it doesn't really fit typal synergies for that being helpful as well. Next is School Days, or Outsmart the Amateur. So 5 mana is a lot, and drawing 3 cards is solid, but 5 mana to draw 3 cards, you kind of fall behind on board state, which can be doing you irreparable damage. And then counter a target spell, draw a card is also pretty nice. Usually you kind of prefer using that mode so you don't fall behind on board, especially if you're at the stage where your opponent's casting like 5 or 6 drops, and you can counter a 6-drop and draw a card is pretty okay. But generally just not the greatest card because 5 mana is a lot for this sort of effect, even though it does have some nice flexibility. Next is Secret Identity. Combat tricks just are generally not a priority, even though this one's reasonable, especially if you're playing this in like a modified deck where it'll keep any buffs it has from like +1/+1 counters or things like that. But turning something into a 1/1 with hexproof is reasonable. Turning something into a 3/4 can be okay, though a lot of the time that's not a major stat boost. Like if you have a 3/3 creature, turning it into a 3/4 with flying and vigilance isn't great. And so generally just like a mediocre combat trick. But if you need a protection spell especially, Secret Identity can be really nice. Unstable Experiment is next. So 2 mana, target player draws a card, then up to 1 target creature you control connives. So you get to draw a card, and then you get to draw a card and discard a card, basically. So draw 2, discard 1 is kind of how this card plays out. But you can get a +1/+1 counter on a creature. It's like okay, it doesn't really do tons of crazy stuff, but it's something you can play if you need to, or if you really have some benefit for discarding stuff. So if you have like some mayhem cards or things like that. Next is Spider-Man No More, or Hide in Mundanity. For 2 mana, you can turn something into a 1/1 with Defender. The problem is giving them a 1/1 oftentimes isn't the biggest downside. It's kind of a big downside because if you're putting this like a 3/3, you're only giving it -2/-2. They can still do stuff with it. They can maybe bounce it back to their hand with an effect that we've already seen a couple of. They can maybe sacrifice it to something. They can maybe use it to block your cards or things like that. There's just ways to use 1/1 creatures with the, like, even though it has Defender, like you might have a 2/1 creature and all of a sudden this card's just super useless because the 1/1 can still trade with your 2/1. It's just not a card that you're going to be happy playing a lot of the time. Though if you desperately need a removal spell, you can sometimes use this in a pinch because it does remove abilities, which is definitely a helpful part of the card, just not great. Next, we are back to the best category with the black card. Scorpion Sting, 2 mana, -3/-3 until end of turn. Totally solid removal spell. You're happy playing this. You don't even have to always kill the creature. Sometimes you can like shrink down their 5/5 mid-combat and use that to kill their creature that's bigger, but just a really nice card. Next is the Spots Portal. So 3 mana, you put a creature on the bottom of its owner's library, which can be helpful. Sometimes creatures have triggers when they die or things like that. And then if you have a villain, there's no downside, but if you don't, then you lose 2 life. So the Spots Portal or Remorseless Coup, definitely a really good removal spell to have access to. Next is Common Crook. Very solid card. When it dies, it creates a treasure token. 2 mana, 2/2s, already pretty good. At like that's baseline stats that you're pretty happy with. And dying into a treasure gives you some nice flexibility to maybe even splash a second color, or just be able to ramp out your more powerful plays ahead of schedule. Next is Merciless Enforcer. So another good 2-drop, 2 mana, 2/1 lifelink, but you can spend 4 mana to deal 1 to each opponent, and that damage will have lifelink. So you're just be able to drain your opponent out a little bit of the game, and in the late game, you can maybe even double activate. Just a nice little 2-drop to have in your black decks. And it's a villain. Next is Scorpion, Seething Striker, or Scorvus Ames, Crime Lord. So 4 mana, 3/3, Death Touch. So Death Touch means this basically has infinite power in combat to trade with opponent's creatures. So that's just pretty nice. And if a creature died this turn at the beginning of your end step, target creature you control connives. Is just a really like solid line of text. Going to help you keep filtering your draws, which is going to be very helpful. Maybe even growing your creatures a little. Just a really nice card. Next is Spider-Man Noir, or Krobel, Envoy of the Bog. So 5 mana, 4/4, Menace, so reasonable stat line. When a creature you control attacks alone, you put a counter on it. So if it's attacking, it's going to attack as a 5/5 Menace. Then you surveil X, where X is the number of counters on it. So just a really solid card, and kind of just fits this category perfectly. The stat line isn't crazy, but the ability is quite nice. If it's targeting itself, it's going to be able to do some good work. If you have if you play this on turn 5 and you have an attack already with a different creature, then you can get the ability right away to put a counter on your creature and surveil X. So just a really nice card to have in your decks, and one you're going to be happy playing. Next is Swarm, Being of Bees. So this is a pretty solid one, or Wekdu, Midnight Hunter. So 3 mana, 2/2, Flash Flyer wouldn't be crazy, but because of the Mayhem ability, you're going to be able to get some reasonable... Sorry. Fire truck just went by, distracted me. But you're going to be able to get some, maybe there's a swarm of bees on the loose. But anyway, you're going to be able to get, not that the fire truck could help with a swarm of bees, really. Anyway, a swarm of bees, because of the Mayhem ability, you're going to be able to cast this for 1 mana a decent portion of the time. And because it has flash, you can even have it where you discard it on your opponent's turn to some effect, and then cast it by surprise for 1 mana, or if your opponent makes you discard a card or something like that, you can get some extra ability to cast Swarm of Bees. And the fact that you can just enable this yourself by having a discard effect and then cast this for 1 mana is really, really nice. So it's a great synergy piece, and there's enough discard effects that this card's definitely solid and one you're going to be happy playing. Next is Tombstone, Career Criminal, or Nil, Vessel of Valgavoth. So for 3 mana, you get a 2/2, which isn't the greatest stat line, but when it enters, you can return a villain from your graveyard to your hand. There's plenty of villains to choose from, so this card's usually going to be able to get you something back, especially if you're playing blue-black, but even within black, there's plenty of villains, and other colors have a couple villains each. And then villain spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, which is also quite useful, because you can maybe use this to ramp out a 5 mana card ahead of schedule, or just maybe double spell, or just making things cost less is generally not the greatest ability, but it's useful on a card that's already solid. Next is Venomized Cat. So 3 mana, 2/3, Death Touch. When it enters mill 2, just pretty much a solid card. Fills your graveyard for stuff that cares about that, and Death Touch is a great mechanic. Next is Venom's Hunger. So 5 mana, you can destroy target creature, you gain 2 life, and it costs 2 less if you control a villain. So in your blue-black decks, where you have a bunch of villains, this card's going to be excellent, and in your other decks, like your red-black decks, where you have a little bit less villains, it's going to be solid, but not quite as excellent. Damning Caress is the arena version of this card. Next is Venom, Evil Unleashed, or Tefex, Gift of Malice. So 5 mana, 4/5, Death Touch. You'll notice there's a lot of Death Touch in black. 5 mana, 4/5 is reasonable, especially with Death Touch, but really the key ability of this card is the 3 mana mode to exile it from your graveyard to put 2 counters on a creature and give it Death Touch until end of turn, which means if you discard this card to some effect, even though it doesn't have Mayhem, it's going to have use from the graveyard. So there's plenty of cards that discard things for value, and being able to discard this one and then being able to use the exile from your graveyard mode is going to be something you're happy with. Next is Risky Research. So 3 mana, surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life, or Clandestine Work. It fills your graveyard decently. It's going to give you good card selection, but card draw that loses you life is really risky when you're on the draw against aggro decks, and that's going to happen a decent percentage of the time. And there's just situations where you're not that happy to be playing this sort of card. So it's a pretty solid card in the right matchup, but it can be kind of risky to play in the wrong matchup. Next is Inner Demons Gangsters or Chaldea Brawlers. So 4 mana, 3/4, discard a card, it gets +1/+0 and gains menace until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. So there's not really a ton of threat of activation here because sure that you can potentially threat of activation it to give it menace or whatever if you've got your opponent low, but you can't like discard your entire hand at instant speed, like if your opponent doesn't block this to deal like 4 extra damage to win the game, which is kind of a little bit of a downside. But it's a pretty good repeatable discard outlet if you have cards that have mayhem that you really want to be discarding or things like that. And a 4 mana 3/4 is just not a great stat line, but you can be a 4/4 mana some percentage of the time, but just not a crazy card, not one you're super happy playing. Next is Prison Break. So for 5 mana, you can return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it, or you can mayhem it for 3 into black. So if you have a mayhem deck where you're casting this for 4, you're pretty happy. If you're casting it for 5, you're kind of unhappy. So that's why it gets that filler grade. Because if you're working it like into your deck properly, you can get a little bit of extra value from this, especially because if you're discarding it to a different effect, you're getting a little bit of extra value. So just not a card that you're playing in like a black deck that can't really enable it, but it's like an okay card. Next is a build around Sandman's Quicksand. This is a card that you're really not that happy to play unless you're enabling Mayhem consistently. Giving all creatures -2/2 is kind of hard to like maximize for your own advantage. Sure, you know it's coming and your opponent doesn't, so that can be helpful. But if you're able to Mayhem this to give your opponent's creatures -2/2, that can be like a game swinging effect where even if you just attack your opponent with all your creatures and then give them all -2/2, or you give them -2/2 and then attack with all your creatures, either one can be pretty reasonable. And Sandman's Quicksand can really like do some serious work if you're able to enable the Mayhem mode, and it's not really a card you're happy playing unless you have a bunch of discard outlets. And so that's why I put it in the build around category. Just the sort of card where you kind of have to see what's in the rest of your deck before you know whether you're happy playing a Sandman's Quicksand. Or you can bring it in out of the sideboard for a matchup where it feels especially good. Next is a bad card, Alien Symbiosis, or Aggressive Symbiosis. I guess the last card was also called Miasmic Mist, or Aggressive Symbiosis. Enchanted creature, gets +1/+1 and has menace, and is a symbiote, which is not a particularly relevant creature type. You may cast it from your graveyard by discarding a card in addition to paying its other costs. This card is just kind of weak. +1/+1 and menace is not really something that you're going to be happy paying 2 mana to give to your creature, especially because with the downside of all of these auras is that if you put an aura on your creature and your opponent kills it, you're just down a card. And +1/+1 and menace is not high enough upside to justify that downside. Even though you can cast it from your graveyard, you do have to discard a card to cast it from your graveyard, so you're not like up a card by casting it from your graveyard over and over. So unless you have insane amounts of mayhem cards and not enough ways to discard cards, or you just really desperately just like don't have another card in your deck, I'd recommend avoiding this card. Moving on to red and back to the best category, we have Superior Foes of Spider-Man. So 3 mana 3/3 trample is totally solid. Also, Restless Razorkin is the arena version. When you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you can exile the top card of your library. If you do, you may play that card until you exile another card with this creature. And because it says play, it means you can play lands with it, which is a huge distinction, is going to be really, really helpful. And this card is going to get you a constant stream of card advantage and be one that you're very happy playing in your deck. Next is Electro's Bolt or Death Flame Burst. 3 mana deal 4 is already a solid rate, even at sorcery speed, and Mayhem means that you can cast it from your graveyard, which means it has good synergy with discard outlets and things like that. And for that one, you get to cast it for 2 mana, which is even better. So a card you're going to be pretty happy playing, regardless of whether you have Mayhem, but if you do have Mayhem, it gets an even bigger boost. Next is Shock. 1 mana deal 2 to any target, a card you're happy playing. 1 mana deal 2 takes out most of the small creatures that you're going to be caring about, and overall a card you're quite happy having. Next is Angry Rabble, or Galvanized Workforce. 2 mana 2/2 trample, and when you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater, you ping your opponent, and you can spend 6 mana to put counters on this creature so it stays relevant in the late game. So Angry Rabble, definitely a 2-drop you're going to be happy to have in your deck, and it just has extra synergy if you're casting big spells. Next is Molten Man, Inferno Incarnate, or just the Infernus. So 3 mana, it's a 0/0, but it gets +1/+1 for each mountain you control, and when it enters, you search your library for a mountain and put it into the battlefield tapped. But when it leaves the battlefield, you sacrifice a land. So you're going to maybe lose that mountain eventually, but it can be a 3 mana 2/2 or 3 mana 3/3, depending on what stage of the game you're in. And it can even ramp you up so you can cast your big spells ahead of schedule, though if it dies, you lose that acceleration. But overall, a pretty nice card because it does force your opponent to deal with it, or you get a pretty nice advantage with that extra land and a growing threat because every mountain you play does grow the card. Next is Shocker, Unshakable, or Kazuo, Ruthless Rival. So 6 mana for a 5/5, so not the greatest stats, but 5/5 is still huge. And 6/6 for 6 mana, that's pretty reasonable, especially because during your turn it has First Strike, which means it's really hard to deal with in combat. And when it enters, it deals 2 to target creature and 2 damage to that creature's controller. So just a really nice 6-drop. It's just 6 mana cards are not usually a priority because 6 mana is a lot, and you don't always even get to 6 mana in a game. But Shocker is a really nice one when you need draft a top end threat, Shocker is going to be the guy you're happy having. Next is Spider-Gwen Free Spirit or Wardens of the Silver Web Summit. So 3 mana, 2/3 reach, reasonable stats. When it becomes tapped, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. So a nice little mayhem enabler if you're able to attack with it. Sometimes you can maybe tap it to a different effect. There's like 1 or 2 cards that let you do that. But generally, just a reasonable card. If you can get attacks in, you can filter your draw step, trigger your mayhem stuff. But it's not going to be anything crazy because a 3 mana, 2/3 is just not anything crazy. Next is Stegron, the Dinosaur Man, or Kefon, Rage Incubator. So 5 mana for a 5/4 menace, totally reasonable card, and it also has the ability to discard it for 2 mana and give a creature +3/+1. So kind of a combat trick plus a giant creature, so that's a nice little flexibility, which makes this a solid card for your deck. Though +3/+1 isn't the best combat trick, it's still extra upside on a card that already has decent stats. Next is Wisecrack. So 3 mana, target creature deals damage to its equal to its power to itself. If it was attacking, it deals you do 2 damage to that creature's controller. So a nice little removal spell for 3 mana. Doesn't kill everything you care about killing. So if it doesn't have a symmetrical stat line or higher power than toughness, you can't kill the creature. But it can still be a pretty useful card that even does some damage to your opponent. And for 3 mana, you can usually answer whatever you care about answering, because a lot of cards are symmetrical, like 5 mana 5/5s or 6 mana 6/6s, things like that. Next is Raging Goblinoid. So we're down to the filler category here. 5 mana 5/4 haste isn't the craziest card, just because a 5 mana 5/4 is a little bit like not the greatest stat line, though haste does make a difference because you can swing in for a bunch of damage. But if you aren't a mayhem deck, this card isn't a card you're super happy with. But if you are a mayhem deck, this card goes from like filler to like being an excellent card. So that's one of the reasons why the filler category kind of exists, is in some decks this card is like a totally solid card that you're happy playing because you're going to be able to discard a lot of things. So in your red-black decks, you're quite pleased with this. In your red-green decks, you're less pleased with this. And so that's kind of the only reason this gets to the filler grade. In red-black, this card's quite nice because 3 mana for a 5/4 haste, if you have like a discard outlet that like is free to use, is something you're pretty happy with. So keep that in mind with your Lavaborn Goblins or your Raging Goblinoids on whether or not you include it in your deck is going to often depend on which of the red strategies you are employing. Next is Spider Islanders. So again, it's going to depend a lot on whether you are a Mayhem deck, because a 4 mana 4/3 isn't really a great stat line, especially with no other abilities, but Mayheming a 2 mana 4/3 is pretty great, especially if you're able to do it early in the game. Sadistic String Puller is the arena version of this card. Next is Taxi Driver. So 2 mana 3/1, it has an ability to give something haste. I guess it's also called Full Throttle Fanatic on arena, but basically not a great ability. Giving something haste if you have to spend an extra mana on it isn't really great, because like you in the late game it's extra upside for sure, but you generally want to be casting your cards on curve in the early game, and a 2 mana 3/1 isn't a crazy stat line. Next is Romantic Rendezvous. So 2 mana, discard a card, then draw 2 cards. If you're playing a deck with a lot of Mayhem cards, this can get a little bit of extra value because you can discard a Mayhem card and then cast it, and then the discard effect didn't really matter as much. But generally, if you're not playing a Mayhem deck, you don't really want this card. So it's kind of like similar to the way that we've been evaluating those Mayhem cards in this filler category. Next is Hobgoblin, Mantled Marauder, or Camonferic Havoc Duo. Again, if you have a bunch of discard in your deck, a bunch of Mayhem in your deck, this card can be solid, but still a 1/2 doesn't really block very well, so you do have to be on the front foot to make this card good. And sometimes you don't want to discard your cards like before combat, because you want to be like holding up combat tricks or things like that. And so this card does kind of box you into trying to discard your cards pre-combat to get the extra damage in. Can definitely be a pretty powerful card, but a 2 mana 1/2 flying haste without, like, if you don't have discard effects in your deck, isn't the greatest. Next is Masked Meower. 1 mana for a 1/1 haste isn't the greatest. And then the fact that you have to discard a card and sack it to draw a card, the fact that you kind of are down a card in that exchange because you had to play the 1/1 and then you discarded it and you sacrificed it to discard a card and draw a card, means that you not only discard a card, but you also sacrifice the Meower to draw a card. So you go down a card in that exchange. So unless you have a synergy deck where you really need discard outlets, this card's kind of not the greatest. Next is Heroes Hangout. So always worth noting, this card is a sorcery. It's also called Firebrain Scheme. I guess the last card was called Skittering Kitten as the alternative mode, but Firebrain Scheme or Heroes Hangout. This is a sorcery, so it looks kind of like it might be an instant, because giving creatures +1/+0 and first strike is kind of an instant type ability, but it's a sorcery. But generally, if you play this card, it's not going to be the greatest. It's kind of like generally you're casting Date Night to like look at the top 2 cards, exile the top 2 cards of your library to maybe help you find extra land drops in the early game or a better spell in the late game. So that's kind of a little bit of card selection. Or sometimes you'll cast Patrol Knight, but not very often. So generally that's how this card's going to play out. Not a huge priority in your decks. Next, we're moving on to the green card. So back to the best category. We have Damage Control Crew or Selesnya Archivist. So 4 mana for a 3/3. When it enters, you can return a card with mana value 4 or greater from your graveyard to your hand. So that's just a card. So it can be an instant It can be a sorcery, or it can be a creature type thing, so any card that has mana value 4 or greater. Or you can use the impound mode to exile target artifact or enchantment, so this is a bit of enchantment or artifact removal. Oftentimes that's going to be a good mode to use if it's available, because you get the value immediately versus returning something that's going to be you have to spend the mana on to get the value, but it's going to be situational, and the fact that you have access to both modes is really, really nice. Next is Spider's Man, Heroic Horde, or the Clutter Cluster. So they chose to go with cards that are a little bit of alliteration for both modes of this card, but 2 mana, 2/3 is already good stats. That's already like a really good card. And it also has a 6 mana mode. If you can get web slinging going on this card at 6 mana, which is a little bit harder because over the course of the game, getting a creature that can be tapped is oftentimes a little bit more difficult. But you can spend 6 mana. If it enters, and cast with web sling, you gain 3 life and create 2/2/1 green spider creature tokens with reach. So you get 3 cards for 1, really, really nice effect, and a really nice top end card, or a card you can just play on turn 2 and be pretty happy with. Also, if you play this on turn 2, then you can oftentimes attack with it on turn 3, because a 2/3 can often attack past your opponent's 2-drops, which can then maybe let you bring it back to your hand to web slinging something else out, and then you can use the web slinging mode of this later. So it's just a really nice card. Next is Terrific Team Up. So for 4 mana, it's an instant. It costs 2 less to cast if you control a permanent with mana value 4 or greater. So in the late game, when you often want to be casting your removal spells, this card gets even better. And then 1 or 2 target creatures you control each get +1/+0 until end of turn. They each deal damage equal to their power to target creature and opponent control. So a nice little removal spell, a little bit of a buff spell as well, so it can push through a little bit of extra damage, or maybe surprise your opponent in combat, something like that. And Terrific Team Ups is a really nice card. Next is Professional Wrestler. So down to the solid cards. This card is really good. It's also called Favorite Fighter. 4 mana for a 4/4, can't be blocked by more than 1 creature. It's hard to have 4/4 worth of stats a lot of the time. So this thing's really hard to block. And when it enters, you create a treasure token. This card has very little synergy with things other than stuff that cares about you casting 4 mana spells. But I mean, it does, like, inherently when it's in play, it's not like a synergy piece a lot of the time. But it's just going to do a ton of work. It almost got into the best category, honestly, because making a treasure when it comes into play, being hard to block, it's like just a solid stat line. Just this card's pretty great, and maybe should have been in the best category. That's how close this card was, kind of borderline there. This card just does a lot of work. Next is Kapow, or Perilous Lunge. 3 mana, put a counter on target creature you control. It fights target creature and opponent controls. Again, this card was almost in the best category. It's just sometimes easy to blow this sort of card out with instant speed removal. So when you can't cast your removal spells, if your opponent is holding mana up, it is a bit of a downside. So that's the only reason this card isn't in the best category. But it's a really solid card. Your green decks need to have interaction still, and this is a really good form of interaction for green decks. 3 mana for this effect is pretty efficient, and getting the lasting advantage of a +1/+1 counter is quite nice. Next is Ezekiel Sims, Spider Totem, or Oris, Last of the Web Lords. So 5 mana, 3/5 reach, totally reasonable stat line. We've seen that many times. It can usually perform decently. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, target spider you control gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And it's worth noting that this is a spider, so it can target itself. So it attacks as a 5 mana 5/7, which is quite nice. And the only reason this card isn't a little bit higher is because it is still, at the end of the day, a 5 mana card. And it's like, just 5 mana cards are generally not as high of a priority. And if you don't have spiders in your deck, it only being able to target itself is a bit of a downside a little bit. But still, it's a really good card, and it can get you value right away. And it's just a, really, really nice card as well. So Ezekiel Sims, a great one for your deck. Next is Guy in the Chair. 3 mana, 2/3, add 1 mana of any color. Also known Eccentric Arachnologist, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on target spider. There are enough spiders in your deck in the format that you're often going to be able to have a target for that, though it is expensive enough that you're probably only using that in the extreme late game. 3 mana mana ramp guys are generally not as good as 2 mana ones, but still gets the job done, still can fix your colors, still a reasonable card to put in your deck. Next is Craven's Cats. 2 mana for a 2/2, or Cruel Caracols. 2 mana for a 2/2 with this activated ability is quite nice. So you can use this card as a threat of activation. So you can spend 3 mana to give it +2/+2, and you can do that at instant speed. So if you attack your opponent on turn 3 with this, they're not going to block with their 2-drop, or usually even their 3-drop, because they won't be able to make the block. And that means that if you're trying to enable web slinging, then you can just attack with this. You don't even have to spend the mana on activating it. The threat of activation is enough, and then you can web slinging it back. So that's a pretty nice upside on this 2-drop. Next is Scout the City. So 2 mana, you can mill 3 cards and put a permanent from among them into your hand and gain 3 life, or you can destroy target creature with flying. The first mode is oftentimes going to be the mode that you use the most. The fact that it gains you 3 life is really what pushes it over the top and makes it playable, because just milling 3 and putting a permanent isn't necessarily the greatest, though there are some benefits to filling your graveyard. There are some cards that care about that. But generally, having access to removal for flyers is pretty useful, and then being able to gain some life while setting up your draws, hitting land drops, things like that can be useful. The fact that in the early game you can hit a land, the late game you can hit a creature is pretty nice. It does have to be from among the cards that you milled, so that's worth noting. Next, Spider-Man, Brooklyn Visionary, or Zan, Tunnel Web Explorer. So 5 mana, 4/3. When it enters, search your library for a basic land, put it into the battlefield, tap, then shuffle. So generally, you don't really care about mana ramp at that portion of the game, but it does have a web slinging mode where if you can get this into play on turn 3, you are ecstatic, because a 3 mana 4/3 that gets you a land is going to really set you up and maybe help you double spell the following turn, hopefully replaying the card that you used to web slinging with it. And overall, this card, if you can set it up, is fantastic. It does require a little bit of help because you want to make sure you have cards that are going to be able to get in the early turns. But if you're doing that, you're going to be really happy to have this card, because web slinging this in is fantastic. Next is Spider Rex, Daring Dino, or Chizak, Apex Arachnosaur. So 6 mana, 6/6, reach, trample, ward 2. Just really, really rock solid card. Great top end threat. It blocks whatever you care about blocking. It has trample, so your opponent can't just chump block it endlessly. It has ward 2, so it's hard to answer. This card is the definition of a solid 6-drop pretty much. Next, Supportive Parents. This is a pretty nice one. So for 3 mana, it's a 3/3, so already solid stats. And you can tap 2 untapped creatures you control to add 1 mana of any color. So this is a nice way to tap your cards to enable web slinging without actually having to attack with them, which is just useful to have. And it can even be used as ramp in a pinch. And the fact that you can use this mode immediately. So you can like play Supportive Parents and then immediately use its ability to tap the Supportive Parents to itself, because that kind of gets around Summoning Sickness in a way. It's kind of nice for potential double spelling in the early turns. Next is Grow Extra Arms, just a sort of combat trick that just you never really have to prioritize, but it can do some work. +4/+4 is a lot of stats after all, but it's just not a crazy card by any means and not one you have to prioritize. Next is Lurking Lizards. So a card that's good if you're casting a lot of big spells, but if you draw this after you've already cast your big spells, it's a 2 mana 1/3. If you play this in the early turns, it's just a 1/3 before you start casting your big spells. A lot of the time, this sort of card has played out reasonably, but not crazy, and so that's why it's in the filler category. Next is Pictures of Spider-Man, or Ancestral Carvings. I guess the last one was Lurking Lizards in both cases. Yeah, Pictures of Spider-Man or Ancestral Carvings. 3 mana, you look at the top 5 and you can get up to 2 creatures from among them. So you can potentially get card advantage, but if you just happen to not have 2 creatures in your top 5, this card is like almost going to lose you the game, because just like 3 mana to just get 1 creature from your top 5 isn't great. And then you can sack it to get a treasure token. It's just kind of inefficient, not really a huge, like you're not getting a ton of selection. You're usually going to only have 2 creatures in your top 5 or something like that. Like you'll have 2 creatures, 2 lands, and like an instant or something like that. So it's not like giving you card selection. It's just like kind of a weird card draw spell that can miss. And generally that's not like my favorite thing. Though if you have a really good creature in your deck, then this card does get a little bit better because it helps you dig for your really good creatures. Next is Wall Crawl, or Rouse the Swarm. 4 mana, you get a 2/1, but it does get buffed into a 3/2 that can't be blocked by creatures with Defender, and it buffs your other spiders, and you gain some life, but just a 4 mana for a 3/2. So if you don't have other spiders, this card's a little bit weak. If you have a couple other spiders, this card gets better and better, but generally 4 mana for this sort of effect is kind of a little bit expensive. Moving on to the multicolored cards, Gallant Citizen, really nice card. 2 mana 1/1. Flexible because of the hybrid mana, and it lets you draw a card when it comes into play. It's perfect if you can web slinging this back, though that's hard to do as a 1/1, but if you are able to get that done, you get even more card advantage. A really nice card you're happy playing in any green or white deck. Next is Spider Manifestation, or Leyline Weaver. This is another really good card for web slinging decks or the ramp decks. It's a 2 mana 2/2 that can ramp you, it has reach, and it untaps if you cast a spell with mana value 4 or greater. But the real key is that you can tap this and then web slinging it back. So it's just like a really good card with web slinging because it can tap itself and you can use it to ramp out your big spells. So a card you're happy playing, and the hybrid mana means if you take it early, it's going to probably make your deck because it fits into red decks or green decks very easily. Next is Web Warriors, great top end card for your green or white decks. Just enters, puts a counter on each other creature. Really good card. Diligent Web Keepers is another one like this. If you do have this card in your deck, try to avoid trading off creatures because you want to make sure you have a big board state. But this card's going to be doing a ton of work in your deck and can absolutely swing a board state. Next is SB/DR, piloted by Penny, or Kumanoso the Watchful. So 5 mana 4/4. Okay stats, vigilance, decent, but putting a +1/+1 counter on a creature and then letting you draw cards whenever a modified creature deals combat damage to a player means that this card is going to be probably creating a must-answer threat. You can put the counter on something else, force your opponent to deal with that. Any other creatures with counters also are going to be drawing you cards, and that's just going to be a real threat like that your opponent's going to have to deal with. They probably have to kill this card right away, and oftentimes you'll have already gotten a card out of it. So it's a really nice card. Next is Spider-Girl Legacy Hero. And you might notice that this best category does have some of these multicolored cards. In a set with only 5 archetypes, multicolored cards get a little bit better because the flexibility benefits from taking a monocolored card does go down a little bit when you can only fit that monocolored card into realistically 2 archetypes. So instead of it being like, oh, I took a white card, it fits into one of 4 archetypes, now it's like, oh, I took a white card, it fits into green, white, or in blue, white. So taking a green, white card is less of a hit to your flexibility than it would be in another set. But Spider-Girl Legacy Hero, or Janai and Hoppy Roof Skippers, is a really perfect card for what Green White's trying to do. It has flying during your turn, so it can get in for damage, and when it leaves the battlefield, you get a 1/1 Green White human creature token. So if you web slinging this back, you still have a board state presence, which is really, really nice. So a fantastic card for Green White. Next is Spider-Man India, or Alisos and Frost Acrobat. So it's expensive to cast for 5 mana, but if you web slinging it, you get a giant creature into play ahead of schedule. And when you cast a creature, you put a counter on target creature you control and give it flying until end of turn. So you web slinging something back with this on turn 3 maybe, and then on turn 4 you cast another creature and give this guy flying as a counter. So it's a 5/5 flyer all of a sudden. This card can absolutely devastate in the early turns, and it's still solid late because a 5 mana 4/4 with that ability is reasonable. Next is Sun Spider Nimble Weber, or Serena Bargain Spinner. So again, one of these hybrid cards. It's a 4 mana 3/2, which isn't the greatest stat lines, but it does fly on your turn, and it gets an aura or equipment card. There's just not as many auras or equipments in this set as there are in maybe some other sets, or just ones that you really, really want to get. There are, of course, a few, and of course, the modified deck does want to have this card, but a 4 mana 3/2 is a bit lower in priority, and so unless you have an insane equipment where you really want to prioritize this card, I mean, it's still going to be good because it's still a solid card regardless, but you really want to make sure you have an aura or equipment to go get with this, because if you don't have that, then you just don't want to play this card. Next, Green Goblin Revenant, or Nuan Sumi Career Criminal. So 5 mana 3/3 flyer with Death Touch. So not the most stats, but Death Touch means it can still trade with anything. When it attacks, you discard a card, then draw a card for each card you've discarded this turn, which is going to be really, really powerful because you are able to just like discard a card to a different effect and then attack with Green Goblin, and then you draw multiple cards, which is going to be pretty nice as upside. So a really good card for red-black. Next is Craven Proud Predator. So not the biggest stat, like nothing crazy here, just a vigilance creature that's going to be the baseline a 3/4 because it's mana value and permanence, it includes itself. So 3 mana 3/4 is already going to be solid, and it can be even bigger. So, and it has vigilance, so just a really solid card. It's not like game breakingly good, but it's going to be a pretty card you're happy playing. And yeah, just again, this card, it's the only reason it's not a great card is because it does have that lack of flexibility from being a multicolored card. It doesn't quite reach the threshold of some of the other ones, but still a really nice one. Next is Morbius, the Living Vampire, or Terle, Entropic Hunger. So 4 mana 3/1 with flying, vigilance, and lifelink, already pretty reasonable, and it can get you some card advantage from the graveyard. Definitely a card that you're going to be pretty happy playing in your blue-black decks. Next is Prowler, Clawed Thief, or Carlos, Suave Schemer. So again, 3 mana 2/3 menace, totally reasonable stat line. It grows as you play other villains, if you're conniving away spells, or just looting, which is also useful. So the connive ability on this is nice. Just a card you're happy playing in your blue-black decks, but not anything too crazy. Next is Pumpkin Bombardment. Again, flexibility is nice. Having access to 3 mana deal 3 is nice. Having access to a discard outlet's nice. Overall, a card that you're happy playing. Or it's also called Knife Trick. Next is Rhino Barreling Brute, or Zakao, Predation's Shadow. So expensive, 7 mana for a 6/7, but it has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste, so it has a huge impact right away, and it's going to be able to block on that same turn, and it attacks if you've cast another spell, you draw a card, so on future turns you can still get card advantage, though by that point in the game your hand is usually relatively empty, but the only reason this card's not great is because 7 mana is a lot, but it does absolutely have a huge impact on the game. Next is Rhino's Rampage. Not a crazy card, +1/+0, and then fighting, and then sometimes you can kill an artifact. There's not a ton of artifacts in this set that you're going to be able to kill with this, but it's still relatively easy to cast. Can be a good removal spell, especially for red-green where you have big creatures. Next is Scarlet Spider Cane, or Kivni Orb Weaver. So it's a 2 mana 2/1 menace, reasonable card, and then if you discard, you can discard a card and put a counter on it, so it can be even bigger if you have other Mayhem cards, and it's a really good card in the Mayhem deck, so it's just a pretty great card for your Mayhem decks overall. It's just, in the late game, if you top deck this, it's often going to be a 2 mana 2/1, which is the reason it's not like crazy, but still, it's still definitely a card you're happy playing. And the only reason it's not great, again, is the flexibility thing. So there's some cards that are good enough to get into that category where they're like, okay, it doesn't even matter that they're inflexible, they can just take over the game single-handedly. And then there's this card. I mean, this card's pretty excellent. I mean, it's a fantastic card, don't get me wrong. Scarlet Spider Cane is a card you're super happy having in your Mayhem deck. Next is Shriek, Troublemakers, or Crash, Reckless End Rider. So it's a constant stream of discard if you need that for your discard outlets, and it can even help things not be able to block, so great for aggression as well. And when a creature your opponent controls dies, you deal extra damage. So totally reasonable card. 3 mana, 2/3 is not the greatest, but it can be totally helpful for you as well. Next is Skyward Spider or Wonder Weave Aerialist. So 2 mana 2/2 with Ward 2 is reasonable, and if you modify it, it gets flying. Perfect card for the modified deck. Not a card you're super happy playing if you're not able to modify it, because a 2 mana 2/2 is nothing crazy, but super solid card for that deck. Next is Vulture, Scheming Scavenger, or Richet, Getaway Accomplice. This card could absolutely win you a game single-handedly if you have like 3 villains in play, because it gives them flying when it attacks. If you don't have a ton of villains in play, you're not super happy with it, so it's not as flexible as some of the other hybrid cards where you generally want this in your blue-black decks. But a 6 mana 4/6 flyer is totally reasonable anywhere, and it's a card that you're going to be happy playing. Next is Wraith, Vicious Vigilante, or Margot on the case. So double strike means that if you put counters on this, put an equipment on this, it can absolutely take over. It can't be blocked, so double strike in that can't be blocked means that this card's going to demand an answer a lot of the time, as long as you're putting counters on it. But again, kind of an inflexible card, only has the one home, and that's why it doesn't go into the great category, or best category. Moving on to Mob Lookout, the filler card of the bunch. Just a little bit underpowered. 0/3 isn't great, even though it does loot when it comes into play. 2 mana 1/4 if you're discarding a spell. Still not the greatest, so that's why it's filler. Next is the artifacts, Bagel and Schmear or Perfected Pastry. So oftentimes you only want to play this in a white deck because that first mode is quite solid. Counter on a creature, draw a card, but being able to just sack it to gain 3 life and draw a card is also reasonable. So totally solid artifact if you need an extra card for your deck. Next is News Helicopter, a couple of 1/1s, one of which has flying. It works well with web slinging or in web because you can return this card to your hand because of its evasion and then get another 1/1 when you replay it. So totally solid card. Or Opulent Valet is the arena version. Subway Train or Vine Woven Chariot, also good when you're playing a green deck. You just play 3 mana to get a vehicle that also gets a land. It's not crazy. Crew 2 is a little bit high, but it can be a nice way to let you work with your web slinging cards because you can just crew up the vehicle and then bounce the card back to your hand. And so that's nice as well, especially because Subway Train is going to get you a little bit of value when it comes into play, as long as you're a green deck. Next is Eerie Gravestone. So 2 mana, it enters and draws you a card, so it's never going to be too bad. And if you're playing a black deck, you can mill 4 cards, put a creature from among them into your hand. The fact that you don't get to just get back any creature from your graveyard isn't the best, but you can just like spend 4 mana and get kind of 2 cards out of it, which is pretty reasonable. It's just nothing crazy. Next is Hot Dog Cart or Treat Trolley. So 3 mana for you making a food token, and then you can tap to add a mana of any color. Just kind of a little bit underpowered, and just generally, if you're going to be trying to play a multicolored deck, you can use this, but otherwise you're not super pleased with it. You don't really care that much. Next is Living Brain, Mechanical Marvel, or Error 9, Viral Node. 4 mana 3/3 reasonable stats. You can turn your other non-equipment artifacts into artifact creatures temporarily. Which is okay, but it's just like there's not a ton of support for that type of strategy, and so you're not going to be like too thrilled playing this card most of the time. Next is Mechanical Mobster or Data Scrubber. 3 mana for a 2/1 is not great stats, even though you get a little bit of graveyard hate. Graveyard hate isn't really that too super useful in this set. There's a couple cards it could impact, and then giving something the ability to connive isn't crazy either because it's a 3 mana 2/1. So even if it becomes a 3 mana 3/2, it's still not great. Next is Passenger Ferry or Carriage of Dreams. When it attacks, you can give something unblockable. It's like okay, but again, Crew 2 is kind of hard. It's only a 4/3. It's like not the biggest impact and only fits into blue decks, which don't necessarily really need this sort of card, and overall not a huge card you're going to really prioritize. Next is Spiderbot. So 2 mana 2/1 reach that gets you a little bit of mana fixing or just helps you hit your land drops. Not a huge priority, again, kind of underpowered and kind of a little bit small ball. Next is Spider-Mobile or Scuttling Spider Coach. So kind of similar to a lot of these cards. It's a vehicle, so again, it can help you enable your web slinging. If you have tons of spiders, it could maybe be a card you're happy playing, but a lot of the time, it's just going to be like a 3 mana 3/3 or 4/4 trample vehicle that's only going to get the buff if it's it's only going to get a buff if you have a lot of spiders, and it's kind of hard to use, so generally not a huge priority unless you have a ton of spiders, in which case even then a vehicle that's like 3 mana and then Crew 2 and needs some other stuff to go right isn't really great. Next is Spider Slayer, Hatred Honed, or Goro Rail, Scourge to Spiders. So 2 mana 2/1, reasonable stat line, can always kill spiders, but your opponent isn't always going to be playing a spider deck, and then it sure has some extra upside from the graveyard. So if you like connive this away or you discard it to an effect, you can then just use it to get a couple of 1/1 flyers, but just kind of a little bit clunky, and a 2 mana 2/1 is just kind of bad stats unless you're fighting spiders. Next is Spider Suit, or Cactarantula Saddle, 1 mana, but then 3 to equip, and you give something +2/+2. Not the greatest. Turning something into a spider hero doesn't usually do tons of crazy stuff, and 3 to equip is a lot to equip, even though +2/+2 is pretty reasonable. Next is Steel Wrecking Ball or Temple Trap, so you can kill a creature for 5 mana usually, or you can like destroy an artifact if you're playing a red deck. But it's like the sort of card that you like want to have sometimes if you don't have any other removal spells, and that's kind of the definition of filler. Next is the land, so a solid land, Vibrant Cityscape, a card that's going to help you fix your mana for relatively low opportunity cost, just makes your mana a little bit better, helps you cast your spells consistently. This is going to be a nice one to have. There is a whole cycle of these cards as well that are going to be in 50% of packs, replacing basic lands. So Ominous Asylum enters tapped, Surveil 1. So when you're playing a red-black deck, definitely take this as a solid card. Surveil 1 is useful for sure. Similarly with Savage Mansion if you're playing red-green, Sinister Hideout if you're playing blue-black, Suburban Sanctuary if you're playing green-white, or University Campus if you're playing blue-white. And then there's one land that, like, if you have a ton of legendary creatures and you're aggressive and trying to give them menace, you could maybe consider playing it, but it's generally not going to be worth doing this because adding 1 to the cost of your spells, if you have to filter mana through this, is going to be pretty tough. So Daily Bugle Building or Fearsome Ridgeline. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave #SpiderPrep in the comments section down below. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.